Hi, welcome to Coding Bible channel. In this video, I will talk about decorator or TypeScript decorator, but we will talk about it in general first, then we will talk about it in Angular. So what is the decorator? Decorator is a type of declaration. And what actually is declaration? Declaration is when you write, for example, a class in your code. You are declaring a class. So this means that we have four types of decorators. We have class decorator because of course we can declare a class, and of course we can declare a property. So we have a property decorator, and we have a method decorator, and we have a parameter decorator. So for example, if we are talking about the class decorator, this means that we can add some parts into the object or the instance of the class, because we actually can add behaviors or functions, or we can add properties, for example. This means that we are adding something into the composition of the object. So now the question is, when should we use a decorator? For example, if you have a common functionality between all the classes on your application, it's better to use decorator. But why we can use decorator? I can use a basic class, for example, and use inheritance. Yes, you are right, but what if you want to change the logic of this common functionality in one or two classes or many classes in your application? What should you have to do? If you try to, for example, edit this function inside the basic class, this means that you will affect all the children. And this is called coupling in programming. However, using decorator, you can make this behavior or change this behavior without affecting all the classes in your code. Let's see this with a simple example. Suppose that we have a class animal, and suppose that all animal only can walk and no one can jump except kangaroo. So if we want the kangaroo to jump, this means that we have to override this function. Okay. Yeah, this is not a good if we have more animals that should jump, what you should do, you have to override the function or update the function here, and this is not good because this will affect all the children. So let's see the same thing with decorator. Okay, and we have defined a function here, and we use it as decorator here. And of course, we removed the movement from the basic class. And suppose that we have many things in this basic class, and we change it, or the movement of the kangaroo to jump using this function, for example. This is not repeating a code because, for example, you can write here const jump and use this. Okay, and then can write jump here, and it will do the same thing. And maybe you can create a function that called walk and one for jump, and if the animal should jump and should walk, you can write you can add two decorators without affecting all the animals or all the children. Actually, there is a better implementation for this case. For example, if we created a decorator called animal, and we make the actions that can be changed from animal to another as inputs in decorator. Okay, it will be easy, because if we change the inputs in the decorator, this means each animal inside the declaration of his class has its own object or its own declaration, its own action, without affecting all animals, which means that we actually changing the actions of the animal, okay, which is looks like the basic class, but it's not a basic class. And this means that we decouple the class, kangaroo class, for example, from the implementation of the actions or the properties from animal itself. And in programming, of course, we prefer decoupling. Also, decorators achieve the separation of concerned principles. For example, if we use the animal decorator, okay, then the animal decorator his responsibility is define the common actions, for example, the common properties. However, the class itself should be concerned only by defining the action that is specific for Kangaroo, for example, or the action that is or the property that is specific for Kangaroo, for example. Okay, this is called the separation of concern. And if we talked about it in Angular, we can say that the component only concerned about manipulating the data that should be shown in the template. Okay, however, it doesn't concern about defining the data that the compiler needs. For example, defining the selector, the template, the URL, the services that should be provided. Okay, and also there is an important reason that makes Angular team doesn't use inheritance, which is TypeScript only allow you to extend one class. For example, let's see in this example, for example, if we here, if for example I write class X, whatever, okay, and I need to extend it here, we can't. It shows an error. Classes can only extend a single class. Okay, and so if Angular team uses a basic class called the component, for example, this means that if you want to create a basic class for whatever use case you have, you can't use it. Okay, so this is another reason why Angular team use decorator, not just a basic class. So this is just a simple explanation about what are decorators and why Angular use decorators and not just use inheritance, for example. And this is the end of the video. And if you have any question, just ask us on YouTube or Facebook. And thank you for watching.